The rain over Brookdale did not fall. It possessed a heavy, relentless curtain that turned the world gray and smelled of wet earth and impending things. Inside the Davidson house, the air was thick, not with the warmth of the meal, but with a silence so brittle it felt as though a misplaced breath might shatter it. Flora Davidson sat stiffly, her tea cooling, the steam no longer rising. Across from her sat Sebastien Bennett. He was a man whose name was a jagged thing, a name spoken in the city only in hushed, frightened clusters, associated with dark glass and iron-fisted ultimatums. Yet here he was, filling their small, modest dining room with an unsettling stillness. His sharp gray eyes precisely the shade of Flora's own dissecting her face with a terrifying tenderness. 26 years of Matilda's carefully curated peace evaporated with a single, low-voiced question from the stranger. "She's mine, isn't she?" Matilda did not look up. She only closed her eyes as if finally letting go of a heavy stone she had carried across a lifetime. Yes, in that one syllable, the schoolteacher in the floral dress vanished. In her place stood a target. Sebastien leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening around him. "My enemies have just discovered you exist, Flora, and from this moment on, you are the only thing in this world that matters to them. If you are listening to this from somewhere across the globe, double tap the screen and tell me your city in the comments. I want to know where this story finds you." Now, let me tell you about the decades of silence that led to that storm. The Brookdale wind was never a blade. It was a sigh, rustling the overgrown bougainvillea that Matilda had tended to with a frantic sort of devotion for 26 years. They had lived here in the amber glow of the ordinary, tucked away in a neighborhood where the most scandalous event was a late library book or a poorly mowed lawn. Matilda had chosen Brookdale with the precision of a mapmaker. It was a place where people did not look too closely, a sanctuary of middle-class safety far from the obsidian towers and blood-slicked alleys of the city Sebastien Bennett called his kingdom. Here, Flora could grow up among books and soft rhythms. Her life a steady stream of predictable Sundays, Flora had always loved the smallness of their house, the way the floorboards groaned in a familiar greeting, the way the radiator clanked like a heartbeat through the winter nights. It was a house without shadows. No men in tailored suits stood guard at the door. No security cameras blinked red in the dark. It was a life built on the beautiful lie that her father was merely a ghost, a smudge of ink on a forgotten page of her mother's past. But the past is never truly buried. It is merely waiting for the rain. Matilda had finalized her disappearance when she was barely showing, carrying a secret that was both her greatest love and her most lethal liability. She had shielded Flora with layers of silence, creating a world of schoolrooms and simple routines. Flora moved through the kitchen now, clearing the remains of a dinner that had ended before it began. She looked at her mother's trembling fingers and then at the man who sat like a dark god in their humble space. She had spent her life believing she was a Davidson, a creature of quiet Brookdale. She was wrong. She was a Bennett. And the storm was no longer outside the window. It was in her blood. The tea set was a relic of Matilda's curated normalcy, white porcelain with painted cornflowers, delicate enough to suggest a life without bruises. When it hit the floor, the sound was not a crash but a high, thin snap, a punctuating end to 26 years of rhythmic deception. Flora looked down at the shards, then at her mother, whose face had become a mask of porous gray. "You told me he was a traveler who forgot the way home," Flora said, her voice dropping into a register of quiet, vibrating anger. "You let me grow up imagining a man who was merely careless. Not a man who owns the air people breathe in this city." Matilda reached out, her fingers still curled as if holding the ghost of the teacup. "I gave you a childhood where you didn't have to look behind you, Flora. Is that not a kind of love? To lie until the lie becomes the floor you walk on." Behind them, the house was no longer theirs. The soft, familiar Brookdale rain was being sliced by the headlights of black SUVs that pulled up with a synchronized, heavy finality. Men emerged tall, silent silhouettes in rain-slicked wool, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a machine. They did not knock. They simply occupied the perimeter, turning the Davidson garden into a strategic outpost. Sebastien Bennett had not moved. He watched the exchange with the detached intensity of a man who had long ago traded his emotions for clarity. He looked at the broken porcelain, and then at the woman he had once loved and the woman he had just found. Matilda always had a penchant for fragile things, Sebastien said, his voice a low thrum that seemed to vibrate in Flora's very marrow. But look at you, Flora. You are not porcelain. Flora turned to him, the shared steel of their eyes catching the warm glow of the lamp. I am a schoolteacher who has work to grade and a life that fits into 1,000 square feet. I am not whatever you are looking for. You are a target, Sebastien corrected, his tone stripped of all sentiment. My enemies do not care about your lesson plans. They care about the fact that Victor Volkov's rival has a heart, and that heart is currently standing in a kitchen in Brookdale. The front door opened without a sound, and a man Marcus stepped in, his suit dry despite the downpour. He nodded to Sebastien. The perimeter is secure, sir, but we must move. The city is waking up to the news. Matilda stood, her small frame suddenly looking very old. We have nowhere to go, Flora. The door I closed 26 years ago has been kicked open. Flora looked at the shards of the cornflower cup, realizing that the house, the neighborhood, and the teacher she had been were all part of the debris. She didn't reach for her mother's hand. Instead, she straightened her back, a gesture so like Sebastien's it made Matilda flinch. Then let us go, Flora said, her voice cold and bright. Since the piece is dead, I want to see the world you've been hiding in. The air in the hallway was cold, a draft that smelled of rain and something metallic. A sharp departure from the scent of Matilda's lavender floor wax. Flora had just reached for her coat when the world outside the front door shifted. It was not a knock, but the sound of wood straining against an unnatural force, a heavy, purposeful thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Sebastien moved before the sound had even fully registered in Flora's mind. There was no haste in his step, only a terrifying, fluid precision. He gripped Flora's upper arm, his touch firm but not bruising, and pulled her toward the kitchen's shadow. Marcus, he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. The glass of the living room window did not merely break. It disintegrated. It was a violent, shimmering intrusion that scattered across the rug like diamonds lost in the dirt. Matilda let out a small, choked sound, a soft "oh" that was more about the loss of her sanctuary than fear for her life. A man, dressed in the dark, nondescript clothing of a shadow, vaulted over the sill. He did not look like a person. He looked like a consequence dot in the dim light. Flora saw the glint of a barrel, a matte black finger of steel pointing toward the space where she had stood only seconds before. The silence of Brookdale had been a lie, she realized. It was a thin veil that had finally been ripped away. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but her hands, the hands that usually held red pens and paperback novels, were steady. She felt a strange, icy clarity. Sebastien's men, who had been silhouettes in the rain, were now inside. The house was suddenly crowded with the sounds of grunts, the muffled scuffle of boots on hardwood, and the heavy, sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. It was over in a matter of heartbeats, a brief, brutal choreography of violence that left the living room smelling of gunpowder and wet wool. Sebastien didn't look at the fallen man. He looked at Flora, his gray eyes searching hers for the break he expected to find. This is the first shadow, he whispered, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a lamp that had survived the struggle. The others will be less clumsy. Matilda stood by the broken window, her gaze fixed on the shattered glass. She looked like a woman watching her own funeral. Flora stepped toward her, but Sebastien's grip tightened. There is no time for the mourning of houses, he said, his voice stripped of the gentleness he had briefly shown. They know the Davidson name now. We leave through the back, or we die in the parlor. Flora looked at the stranger on her floor, then at the father she had just met, and realized the teacher she was had died the moment the glass broke. She reached out and took her mother's trembling hand, her voice coming out as a command. Come, mother. The rain is better than the shadows. The transition was not a departure so much as it was an extraction. a clinical removal of a life that had felt, until an hour ago, as solid as the stone foundation of the Davidson home. The rain continued its steady, indifferent weeping as Flora was guided toward the motorcade. The SUVs were obsidian monoliths, their engines humming with a low, predatory vibration that seemed to swallow the quietude of the street. Inside the vehicle, the air was conditioned and smelled of expensive leather and filtered oxygen, a scent that carried no history. Flora sat between her mother and Sebastien, her body stiff, her knees pressed together. Matilda was a small, collapsing star beside her, clutching a handbag that contained only a few hurried essentials and a lifetime of failed secrets. As the car pulled away, Flora leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the rectangular clarity of the rearview mirror. In that small, silvered frame, she watched Brookdale diminish. She saw the familiar silhouette of their lopsided porch, the yellow glow of the street lamp that always flickered at midnight, and the silhouette of her neighbor's oak tree. These were the coordinates of her existence, the geography of a woman who taught geometry and believed in the sanctity of a well-brewed cup of tea. Now, they were merely receding points on a map she was no longer allowed to carry. "Do not look back with such longing, Flora," Sebastien said. His voice did not grate. It smoothed over the jagged edges of the moment like oil on water. That house was a shield, but a shield eventually breaks under enough pressure. "You are moving toward the sword now." Flora did not turn to him. She watched a child's forgotten bicycle on a lawn disappear into the gray mist. "It was not a shield," she whispered, her voice steady despite the trembling in her heart. "It was a home. There is a difference between being protected and being hidden." "In my world," Sebastien replied, and she could hear the faint, dry smile in his tone. "They are exactly the same thing." The motorcade accelerated, the suburban houses giving way to the industrial fringes of the city, where the lights were harsher and the shadows more deliberate. Flora watched the reflection of her own eyes in the mirror, gray, sharp, and suddenly unfamiliar. She realized then that the woman who had lived in Brookdale was not the one looking back at her. That woman had stayed behind in the shattered glass of the parlor. The woman in the SUV was someone new, someone forged in the rain, riding toward a kingdom she was born to inherit but was determined to despise. The gate was a massive, intricate thing of wrought iron that did not so much open as it exhaled. A slow and heavy parting that signaled the end of the world Flora knew. Beyond it lay a driveway lined with ancient, brooding oaks, their branches interlocking like the fingers of a giant in prayer. When the SUV finally came to a halt, the house that loomed before them was not a home, but a statement. It was a structure of limestone and shadow, a fortress built with the kind of wealth that did not shout but instead sat with a cold, terrifying weight upon the land. Inside, the foyer was a vast expanse of white marble, so polished it looked like frozen water. Flora's footsteps, usually softened by the carpets of her Brookdale life, now echoed with a sharp, hollow vulnerability. The air was different here. It was filtered and still, carrying a faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and something clinical. As if the very atmosphere was under Sebastien's command, a man in a suit that cost more than Flora's yearly salary stood by a sweeping staircase, his face a mask of professional emptiness. He bowed slightly, a gesture that felt less like respect and more like the recognition of a new piece of property. "Welcome, Miss Davidson," he said, his voice as smooth and characterless as the walls. Flora turned to Sebastien, her neck stiff. "Is this where the target stays? In a museum of silence?" Sebastien handed his coat to a waiting servant without looking. "This is the Citadel, Flora. It is the only place in this country where your heartbeat is a certainty rather than a gamble." "And my mother?" Flora asked, watching Matilda wander toward a velvet sofa, looking as though she might simply dissolve into the upholstery. "Matilda knows this house," Sebastien said, finally looking at Flora. "She knows its safety, and she knows its price." Flora moved toward the high, arched windows that overlooked a garden enclosed by stone walls topped with discreet, glinting wires. A woman in a black uniform appeared, offering a tray of water in crystal glasses. She did not speak. She simply stood there, an extension of the house's chilling efficiency. "I want to go for a walk," Flora said, her voice sounding small in the vastness. "The grounds are secure, but you will be accompanied," Sebastien replied, his tone final. Flora realized then that she had not been brought to a sanctuary. She had been brought to a place where the doors were thick enough to keep the world out, but also thick enough to keep her in. She was a guest of honor in a gilded cage, surrounded by silent observers who moved like ghosts through the marble halls. She looked at her reflection in a pure mirror, a woman in a rumpled coat standing in a palace of stone, and understood that in the citadel, freedom was the only luxury they did not stock. The velvet boxes arrived at noon, a small mountain of dark blue and emerald green that looked obscene against the austere, gray-veined marble of the citadel's breakfast room. Sebastien sat at the head of the table, a man who believed that every silence had a price and every woman had a number. He gestured toward the boxes with a flick of a gold-plated pen. "Open them, Flora. They were curated for your skin tone," he said, his voice carrying the casual weight of a king bestowing land upon a subject. Flora did not touch them. She looked at the boxes with the same detached curiosity she might apply to a strange specimen in a biology lab. "I am a woman who buys her clothes from sales racks in Brookdale, Sebastien. I do not have the skin tone for diamonds that are older than my mother's secrets." "They are not just diamonds," Sebastien replied, his gaze narrowing. "They are an insurance policy. In this world, you wear your wealth as armor." He signaled to a man standing by the door, another silent, stone-faced shadow. "And this is Elias. He will be your primary detail. He has been vetted through 3 generations of my family. He will breathe when you breathe." Flora stood, the legs of her chair scraping against the marble, a sharp, discordant sound that seemed to offend the house's polished dignity. She walked past the emeralds and the diamonds, stopping only when she was inches from her father. The shared steel of their gray eyes locked, a silent collision of 2 identical wills. "You are trying to wrap me in silk so I won't feel the blood on the walls," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of defiance. "I do not want your stones, and I do not want more shadows following me to the bathroom. I want the one thing you are currently hoarding." Sebastien tilted his head, his face a mask of careful calculation. "And what is that?" "The truth," Flora whispered. "I want to know what you do when you aren't buying jewelry. I want to know why people's voices turn to ash when they speak your name. I want to know exactly what kind of monster my mother was running from." Sebastien's expression didn't break, but a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or a shard of ancient regret passed through his eyes. He stood slowly, towering over her, his presence a suffocating, heavy thing. "The truth is a heavy burden for a schoolteacher, Flora," he said, his voice dropping into a register of cold finality. "It is the only thing in this house that I cannot give you, because once you have it, you can never go back to being the woman who lived in Brookdale. That woman died when your men broke my window," Flora replied, her chin lifting. "Now, give me the ledgers or take the diamonds back. I will not be a guest who is also a blind person." Sebastien looked at her for a long moment, seeing the stubborn strength he had bequeathed her. And for the first time since his arrival, the ruthless boss of the city looked truly uncertain. The evening in the citadel did not settle. It loomed, a heavy indigo blanket that smelled of rain-drenched stone and the wax of candles that burned with a too perfect flame. Flora found her mother in the solarium, a glass-domed room where the moonlight turned the tropical ferns into skeletal shadows. Matilda sat in a wicker chair that looked absurdly frail against the backdrop of limestone walls, her tea forgotten and cold on a low table. He was not always a statue made of ice. "Flora," Matilda said, her voice a thin thread that pulled at the silence. She did not look at her daughter. She looked through the glass at the perimeter lights that blinked like red eyes in the dark. 26 years ago, Matilda explained, the city had been a different kind of furnace. Sebastien had been a man of fire, not marble. He was a prince of the streets, possessed by a desperate, jagged ambition that made him both brilliant and terrifying. "He loved me with a violence that left no room for anything else," she whispered. "But his world was a hungry thing. It demanded blood for every inch of territory he gained. Matilda described the night. She realized she was carrying Flora the same night. A car bomb had turned their favorite restaurant into a blackened husk of metal and screams. She had looked at Sebastien as he stood in the wreckage, his face splattered with the soot of his own life, and saw that he was no longer a man, but a monument to war. He had looked at her with those gray eyes, the eyes Flora now wore, and for a second, he had looked afraid. Not for himself, but of what he was becoming. "I didn't leave because I hated him," Matilda said, finally turning to Flora, her eyes wet and bright. "I left because I saw that he would burn the whole world to keep me, and I couldn't let you be born in the ashes. I stole you from him to save his soul as much as yours." She spoke of the panicked flight, the changing of names, the way she had scrubbed the scent of expensive cigars and gunpowder from her skin until her hands bled. She had traded a kingdom of fear for a life of coupons and lopsided porches. And she had done it without a second thought. "He is a monster." "Yes," Matilda concluded, the word landing with a soft, heavy thud. "But he is a monster who loved us enough to let the silence last for 26 years. He didn't come looking for us, Flora. He respected the ghost I became until the world forced his hand." Flora looked at her mother's trembling hands and felt a shift in the air. The man in the study was no longer a stranger from a newspaper. He was a man who had been hollowed out by a choice he hadn't made. The monster had a history, and that history was written in the very silence Flora had grown up in. The following morning, the citadel did not wake with the soft clinking of breakfast porcelain, but with the low, rhythmic hum of black idling engines. Sebastien appeared at Flora's door, his silhouette a sharp, charcoal-gray intrusion into the pale morning light. He did not ask if she was ready. He simply adjusted his cufflinks gold and cold and waited for her to follow. They were driven to a warehouse by the docks, a place where the air tasted of salt, rust, and the oily sweat of machines. Inside, the light was sparse, falling in dusty, rectangular shafts from windows high above. A man was tied to a chair in the center of the vast, hollow space. He was a small man, his eyes darting like trapped birds, his breathing a ragged, stuttering thing. He had stolen from the Bennett accounts a few thousand, a pittance in the geography of Sebastien's wealth, but he had done it with the confidence of a man who thought he was invisible. Sebastien stood before him, his posture so relaxed it was predatory. He did not shout. He did not even raise his voice. He spoke to the man about the weather, about the fragility of loyalty, while Flora stood in the shadows, her stomach a cold knot of nausea. "You have worked for me for 10 years. Joseph," Sebastien said, his voice a low, melodic thrum. "I paid for your daughter's schooling. I sent a doctor when your mother fell ill. Do you remember?" The man nodded frantically, his tears making clean tracks through the soot on his face. "Yes, sir. Please. I was desperate." "You were not desperate. You were greedy," Sebastien corrected gently. He turned to Flora, his gaze steady and clinical. "Watch this, Flora. This is the truth you demanded." He turned back to Joseph. "I could forgive you. I could give you another chance. But in my world, kindness is a currency you can only spend once. If I spend it on you today, I have nothing left for the men who stayed loyal while you were taking what wasn't yours." He made a small, almost bored gesture with his hand. Marcus stepped forward. There was no theatrical violence, only a swift, heavy efficiency that ended with the man being dragged into the deeper darkness of the warehouse. Sebastien walked back to Flora, the scent of his expensive cologne now mingling with the smell of the man's terror. "You think I am cruel," he said, looking at the shared steel of their gray eyes. "But cruelty is disorganized. This is order. If people do not fear the consequence of betrayal, there is no safety for anyone, not for me, not for your mother, and certainly not for you." Flora looked at the empty chair and felt the Brookdale schoolteacher within her wither. She realized then that Sebastien didn't just want to protect her. He wanted to hollow her out and fill her with his own hard, crystalline logic. She did not look away. She forced herself to breathe the metallic air, her voice a thin, sharp blade. You didn't spend kindness on him, Sebastien. You spent it on me. You wanted me to see that you have no heart left to break. No, he whispered, leaning close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. I wanted you to see why I am the only one who can keep you alive. The citadel did not fall with a roar, but with a series of small, clinical betrayals, the silent deactivation of the West Gate infrared, a sudden, heavy static in the security headsets, and then the smell of ozone. Flora was in the library, the scent of old paper and leather usually her only solace, when the first window shattered. It was not a stray stone, but a concussive blast that sent the glass flying inward in a rain of jagged teeth. Marcus moved with the terrifying speed of a man whose reflexes were forged in the dark. He did not speak. He only lunged, his weight slamming into Flora to pin her behind the heavy mahogany desk. The air, once so filtered and still, was suddenly choked with the acrid bite of gunpowder and the chalky dust of pulverized limestone. The sound was what stayed with her, the rhythmic, mechanical thrum-thrum-thrum of suppressed gunfire, a noise that sounded less like a weapon and more like a heavy industrial stapler. From the hallway came the shouts of men, not in the frantic pitch of Brookdale, but in the low, guttural grunts of professionals completing a task. It was a Bennett-style firefight, efficient, brutal, and utterly devoid of mercy. Sebastien appeared in the doorway, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the flickering emergency lights. He was not the man who bought jewelry or discussed the weather. He was a creature of the smoke, his movements a fluid, lethal dance as he returned fire, his face a mask of such absolute coldness that it made Flora's blood feel like slush. A bullet struck the desk, a sharp, singing ping that sprayed splinters of wood against Flora's cheek. She felt a heat she had never known, a visceral, animal terror that stripped away the teacher, the reader of books, the woman of Brookdale. She lay on the cold floor, her fingers digging into the expensive rug, and watched as a man in a dark tactical vest slumped against the bookshelf, his blood staining the spines of the classics. Get her to the vault. Sebastien's voice was a command that sliced through the cacophony. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He was a wall of steel between her and the void. Marcus dragged her upward, her boots skidding on the marble, and as they ran through the corridors, Flora saw the cost of the breach, the silent servants now lying in ungraceful heaps. The white marble of the foyer slicked with a dark, spreading ink that she knew was life. She realized then that Sebastien's world didn't just have shadows. It had a bottomless hunger. As the heavy steel door of the vault began to hiss shut, Flora looked back and saw her father standing alone in the smoke, a king defending a kingdom of ghosts, and she knew that the scent of Brookdale lavender was gone forever. The silence of the citadel after the breach was a heavy, artificial thing, a thick layer of dust that no amount of marble polishing could ever quite reach. Flora stayed in the guest suite, where the air was filtered and sterile, a sharp contrast to the smell of gunpowder that had lodged itself in the back of her throat. She needed the sound of a voice that didn't carry a command, a voice that knew the rhythm of Brookdale's Tuesday morning markets. She found a burner phone, a small, plastic anonymity left on the nightstand by one of Sebastien's shadows, and dialed the number of Sarah, her closest friend, the woman who had once helped her grade geometry exams over glasses of cheap, sour wine. The ringing was a thin, hopeful wire stretching across the city. "Sarah?" Flora whispered, her heart a frantic drumming against her ribs. "It's me. I'm okay. I need to know you're okay." There was a pause, a hollow, buzzing space where a laugh should have been. When Sarah spoke, her voice was a stranger's, flat, rehearsed, and vibrating with a terror so profound it made Flora's skin go cold. "Don't call here again, Flora, please." A man came. He paid the mortgage. He said it was a gift for my silence. He told me that being your friend was a luxury I could no longer afford. The line went dead, the dial tone a mechanical shriek in the quiet room. Flora dialed her head of school, then the neighbor whose cat she used to feed. But the results were the same. A disconnected line, a stuttered excuse, or a voice that broke with the weight of a bribe they hadn't dared to refuse. Sebastien had not just moved her body. He had erased her geography. He had systematically dismantled the bridges back to her old self, turning her friends into paid spectators of her disappearance. She walked out to the grand balcony, her boots clicking against the limestone. Sebastien was there, silhouetted against the city lights that glittered like scattered embers. He did not turn around. He already knew the silence she had found. "You bought them," Flora said, her voice a jagged blade. "You turned my life into a transaction." "I secured them," Sebastien replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "In my world, a friend is a lever. If they aren't paid to be silent, they are tortured for information. I gave them the kinder option." He finally turned, his gray eyes, her eyes searching hers with a chilling, clinical certainty. "The schoolteacher is a ghost, Flora. There is no one left in Brookdale who remembers you as anything other than a dream they were paid to forget." Flora looked at the vast, dark garden and realized that the citadel was not just a fortress. It was a void. She was no longer a woman with a history. She was a Bennett, a singular point of existence in a world of paid shadows and broken porcelain, truly alone with the man who had hollowed out her world to save her life. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum and a silence that did not feel like a threat. Flora found Sebastien in the solarium, though he was not looking at the plants. He was hunched over a heavy oak table covered in architectural blueprints and encrypted ledgers. The lamp cast a harsh, amber light that deepened the hollows of his cheeks, making him look less like a king and more like a man exhausted by the weight of his own crown. Flora did not hover in the doorway. She walked to the table and began to trace the lines of a logistics map with a finger that was no longer trembling. She pointed to a bottleneck in a shipping route, a small, overlooked inefficiency that her mathematical mind flagged with instinctive speed. "You're losing 3 hours here," she said, her voice a calm, steady hum. "The timing of the tide doesn't match your transport window. It's a simple calculation of variables." Sebastien looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, only a startled, gleaming recognition. He looked at the map, then back at his daughter, and a slow, dry chuckle vibrated in his chest. "Your mother always said you were too smart for Brookdale," he whispered. "She told me once that you looked at a flower and saw the Fibonacci sequence. I didn't understand then. I do now." He pulled out a chair for her, a gesture that carried a new, quiet kind of respect. For the next hour, the citadel was not a fortress or a prison. It was a classroom where the teacher and the master met as equals. They moved through the ledgers with a synchronized, cold logic, two minds that operated on the same jagged frequency. Flora saw the way he structured his world not through senseless violence, but through the same precise, stubborn geometry she used to teach. "You have a heart made of steel, Flora," Sebastien said, leaning back, the shared light of their gray eyes reflecting off the glass ceiling. "You think you are different from me because you like books and quiet mornings, but you possess the same refusal to be broken. You don't just want to survive. You want to understand the mechanism of the cage." Flora felt a strange, terrifying warmth, a sense of belonging that Brookdale had never quite provided. "I am like you," she admitted, the words landing with the weight of an anchor. "But I will not be used by you. If I am to be a Bennett, it will be on my terms, with my hands on the wheel." Sebastien smiled, a real smile that reached the corners of his weary eyes. "I would expect nothing less from my own blood. We both have a stubborn heart, Flora. It is a curse, but in this city, it is the only thing that doesn't rust." The smell of the van was a mixture of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of unwashed skin, a scent that would have terrified the woman Flora was 3 weeks ago. Now, it only made her pulse a steady, calculating thrum. She lay on the floorboards, her wrists bound with zip ties that bit into her skin with a cold, plastic indifference, when the doors opened. She was hauled upward into the harsh, flickering light of an abandoned cannery. The air was thick with the ghost of salt and rotting fish. A man stood before her, his suit too loud, his jewelry too bright, his face etched with a grin that was meant to be predatory but felt merely theatrical. This was Victor Volkov's primary rival, A man named Lorenzo who operated on the delusion that Sebastien Bennett's daughter was a soft thing made of chalk dust and geometry theorems. "So, this is the secret weapon," Lorenzo said, his voice a coarse rasp that scraped against the silence. He reached out to flick her chin, a gesture of casual belittlement. "A schoolteacher from Brookdale. Sebastien has become sentimental in his old age. He thinks a daughter is a treasure, but I see only a very expensive ransom note." Flora did not flinch. She did not weep. She looked at him with the shared steel of her gray eyes, a gaze so clinical it made his grin falter. In the silence of her mind, she was not reciting a prayer. She was calculating the structural integrity of the rusted chair behind her and the distance to the jagged piece of scrap metal near his boot. "You think because I know how to explain the Pythagorean theorem, I do not know how to find the shortest distance between your jugular and a shard of glass," Flora said, her voice a low, melodic hum that carried the weight of a threat. Lorenzo laughed, a jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You speak like him, but you have lived a life of lopsided porches and quiet Sundays. You are a pawn, Flora, and pawns do not make threats. They are moved. Pawns are the only pieces that can become queens," Flora replied, her voice dropping into the cold register she had learned in the solarium. She felt the zip-tie strain as she shifted her weight, the plastic digging deeper. She looked at the men surrounding her, 4 of them, overconfident and bored. They saw a victim. They saw a schoolteacher lost in a storm. They did not see the Bennett blood beginning to boil beneath the surface, a lethal inheritance that was finally claiming its territory. She began to cough, a soft, convincing sound of a woman breaking, and as Lorenzo leaned in to savor her weakness, Flora realized that underestimating a woman of books was the last mistake he would ever make. The cannery was a cavern of rot and brine, its silence broken only by the rhythmic drip of a rusted pipe, a sound that, in Flora's mind, became the steady ticking of a stopwatch. Lorenzo had retired to the office, a glass-walled perch that smelled of his own hubris, leaving her with a single guard whose boredom was a palpable, sluggish thing. He sat at a scarred desk, his chair balanced on 2 legs, scrolling through his phone with the vacant intensity of a man who believed the world was already conquered. Flora did not struggle against the zip-ties. She seduced them. She remembered Matilda's voice, not the trembling one from Brookdale, but the one that spoke of scrubbing stains until the skin broke. She used her sweat and a slow, agonizing rotation of her wrists to find the precise angle where the plastic grew taut. She waited for the guard to reach for a cigarette, his focus drifting to the flicker of his lighter dot in that heartbeat. Flora lunged. She did not scream. She made a sound that was less a cry and more a jagged exhale of 26 years of repressed fire. She used the weight of her bound arms like a club, the plastic ties catching the guard across the bridge of his nose with a wet, sickening crack. As he tumbled, she didn't recoil. She was her father's daughter now, a creature of cold geometry. She found the shard of glass she had mapped out earlier, a fragment of a broken soda bottle, and sawed through her restraints with a frantic, rhythmic precision that turned the pain into a secondary variable. When the ties snapped, her hands did not shake. She moved toward the shadows, her feet silent on the salt-crusted floor. She was no longer thinking of lesson plans or lopsided porches. She was thinking of the structural weaknesses of the heavy iron door and the scent of the men in the hallway. She neutralized the alarm system with a single, brutal pull of a wire, a trick she had deduced from watching Marcus at the Citadel. By the time the heavy, steel-toed boots of Sebastien's men began to thunder against the exterior, Flora was not a victim waiting for a rescue. She was standing in the center of the dark room, a heavy iron wrench in her hand. Her gray eyes, Sebastien's eyes fixed on the office door, when Sebastien finally kicked the door open, the light of the moon flooding the cannery like a silver judgment. He did not find a weeping girl. He found Flora standing over a prone Lorenzo, her breathing steady, her face splattered with a dark, metallic ink that was not hers. He stopped, his weapon lowered, and for the first time, he saw not a legacy, but a mirror. "You're late," Flora said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of steel. "I've already accounted for the variables," Sebastien did not move. He only nodded, a slow, profound recognition of the blood that finally knew its own name. The citadel did not feel like a prison the next morning. It felt like a vessel, a vast and quiet ship awaiting a new navigator. Sebastien sat in the mahogany-shadowed study, the morning sun casting long, golden bars across the floor that looked less like a cage and more like a path. He watched Flora enter. She moved differently now, with a stillness that was not the caution of a schoolteacher, but the calculated poise of a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and had not blinked. "You cannot stay in the solarium forever, Flora," Sebastien said, his voice a low, resonant hum that carried the weight of a surrender. "And I cannot keep you behind marble walls until the world turns to ash. I thought I could protect you by hiding you, but you have proven that you are most dangerous when you are seen." He pushed a thick, leather-bound folder toward her. It was not a ledger of shadows or a map of illicit territories. It was the blueprint for the Bennett Foundation, the hospitals, the urban renewal projects, the vast, shimmering network of legitimate influence that acted as the empire's visible skin. "My world is a binary thing," he continued, his gray eyes, her eyes softening with a pride that was almost painful to witness. "There is the blood, which I will always handle, and there is the light, which requires a mind that understands the geometry of hope. You have the intellect to bridge them. I want you to run the foundation. I want you to take the name I gave you and make it stand for something other than a threat." Flora ran her hand over the embossed crest on the folder. She thought of the classroom in Brookdale, the red pens, and the simple geometry. Those things were not lost. They were merely being repurposed. She realized then that Sebastien was offering her the only thing that mattered in his kingdom, a seat at the table that did not require a weapon. "I will not be a figurehead, Sebastien," she said, the shared steel of their gaze locking in a new kind of pact. "I will not be a ghost that you parade at galas to prove your humanity." "I know," he whispered. "You will be the one who ensures we have a humanity left to save." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city that he had spent decades conquering. "I spent 26 years convinced that a daughter was a vulnerability. I was wrong. You are the only thing I have built that might actually survive me." Flora opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first page with the practiced efficiency of a woman who was already calculating the variables. The rebirth was not a loud thing. It was a quiet, steady breath in a house that had finally stopped holding its own. The balcony of the Bennett penthouse did not feel like a precipice anymore. It felt like a podium. A year had passed since the rain in Brookdale had washed away the schoolteacher with the red pens, and in her place stood a woman who moved with the quiet, terrifying grace of a person who had reconciled with her own shadow. Flora stood at the limestone railing, the city below a shimmering carpet of amber and obsidian, a vast geometry of lives that she now helped to calculate. Beside her, Sebastien stood in a silence that was no longer heavy, but companionable. He had aged in a way that suggested a softening of the stone. The lines around his eyes were deeper, carved by a strange, new exhaustion that came from building schools instead of drafting war plans. He watched her with a pride that was stripped of his usual clinical detachment. "The hospital in the North Ward opened its doors today," Flora said, her voice a steady, melodic thrum in the cool evening air. "The funding from the foundation is stable. We didn't have to use a single threat to get the permit signed. We used the data. We used the logic of necessity." Sebastien chuckled, a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the hum of the city. "You used the Bennett name, Flora, but you used it like a surgeon's knife rather than a blunt instrument. I am still learning the difference." Flora looked at her hands, the hands that had once graded geometry exams and were now signing the destinies of thousands. She thought of Matilda, who had moved to a sun-drenched villa in the hills, finally free from the frantic tendency to tend to bougainvillea that hid a secret. Her mother had found a peace that was not built on a lie, and Sebastien had found a legacy that would not end in a gutter. "I am still a teacher," Flora whispered, turning to him, the shared steel of their gray eyes catching the moonlight. "I am just teaching a different kind of lesson now." I am teaching this city that a storm can be tamed, provided you aren't afraid of the lightning." Sebastien reached out, a rare, brief touch of his hand on her shoulder. "You are more than a teacher, Flora. You are the one who ensured the storm didn't destroy us all." She looked back at the skyline, feeling the weight of the citadel behind her and the limitless possibilities of the night ahead. The woman from Brookdale was gone, but her stubborn heart remained, beating now with a rhythm that was both hers and his. She had not just survived the collision of their worlds. She had mastered the debris. As the first star blinked into existence over the obsidian towers, Flora Davidson realized that she was no longer merely a daughter of the underworld. She was the architect of its light. If the story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Remember that sometimes the most painful truths can lead to the most beautiful beginnings, and it's never too late to heal what's been broken. Until next time.